Jonah lived in a house built from the timber of his own silence. The land around his small ranch was vast and unforgiving, a perfect mirror for the geography of his heart. 10 years he had been a widower, a decade spent paying penance to a ghost whose memory was the only warmth he allowed himself. His days were a rigid catechism of labor, from sunup to sundown, a way to exhaust the body so the mind had no energy left for remembrance. With him lived his daughter, Abigail, a child of 8 who had learned to read the weather in her father's face and knew that most days were overcast. She was a quiet creature, a small shadow in a world of stark light and long, lonely evenings. The town was a half-day's ride, a place of noise and judgment he avoided whenever possible, but supplies were a necessity, a chain that tethered his isolation to the world of men. It was on one such trip, the air thick with dust and the casual cruelty of a frontier settlement, that he saw her. He had not intended to look, for looking was a form of engagement he had long since abandoned. But the sound, a peal of mocking laughter followed by a woman's cry of distress, cut through his carefully constructed indifference. In the shadowed alley between the general store and the saloon, a group of rough men had cornered a Chinese woman. They had torn the bundle of clean laundry from her arms, scattering folded white shirts into the filth, and as a final, brutal joke, they had stripped her of her modest outer tunic, leaving her in a thin undergarment, exposed and utterly humiliated. They laughed as she tried to cover herself, their jeers like stones. Something inside Jonah, a piece of him he thought long dead and buried, broke the surface. He moved without thinking, his large frame a sudden interruption to their sport. He said nothing. He simply pulled the heavy wool blanket from his wagon, strode into the alley, and draped it over her trembling shoulders. The men, surprised by his silent, imposing presence, shuffled away, their laughter dying in their throats. He looked at the woman, her face a mask of shame, and knew she could not return to the life she had here. His voice, when it came, was rough from disuse, a practical, unadorned offer. "I need a housekeeper. You need a place to go." It was not kindness. It was a transaction, an exchange of one form of shelter for another. She nodded, clutching the blanket, and followed him to the wagon, leaving her old life scattered in the dust behind her. Her name was Leanne, and she arrived at his ranch as quietly as the dusk. The house she entered was meticulously clean but devoid of life, a place where dust was not allowed to settle but joy had never been invited to stay. It was a shell, not a home, and it smelled of old wood, soap, and a deep, abiding loneliness. For 2 days, she barely moved from the small room he had given her, the wool blanket her only shield. Jonah did not press her. He continued his routine, the rhythmic thud of his axe and the lowing of his cattle the only sounds. He left a plate of food by her door each evening, and each morning, the plate was empty. It was an arrangement of silent acknowledgement. On the 3rd morning, a new scent filled the air. It was the smell of baking bread. He entered the kitchen to find Leanne by the hearth, her hands dusted with flour, her movements sure and economical. She had found his meager supplies and was creating sustenance from them. She did not speak, simply sliced a thick, warm piece of bread and placed it on the table for him, and a smaller one for Abby. The bread was a simple thing, but in that house, it was a miracle. It was the beginning of her quiet transformation of his world. She moved through the barren rooms like water, finding the cracks and gently filling them. She mended the curtains his late wife had sewn, her stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She found a patch of earth by the back door where the soil was still good and began to coax a small garden of herbs from the hard-packed ground. She did not try to fill the silence with chatter, instead, she filled it with the soft sounds of life, the snip of scissors, the stir of a spoon in a pot, the whisper of a broom across the floorboards. Jonah watched her from a distance, a silent, wary observer. He had brought a housekeeper to his ranch, but what he had received was a woman who was slowly, patiently, teaching his house how to breathe again. Abby, who had learned her father's language of distance, was the first to cross the invisible line. She was drawn to Leanne's quiet industry, to the gentle grace in her hands. The child would sit for hours just watching her, a small, still audience to the daily rituals of mending and making. Leanne, in turn, never forced an interaction. She simply made a space for Abby in her world, sometimes leaving a small, sweet rice cake where the girl could find it, or humming a soft, unfamiliar melody as she worked. One afternoon, Abby approached Leanne as she was polishing an old silver locket, one of the few possessions she had managed to keep. It was worn smooth with time, its surface a cloudy mirror. Abby pointed a small finger at the object. "Is it for remembering?" she asked, her voice a little bird in the quiet room. Leanne's hand stilled. She looked at the child, her dark eyes holding a universe of sorrow that was as vast as Jonah's own. "Yes," Leanne said softly. "It is for remembering my son." Abby considered this, her expression serious. She then looked toward the window, where her father was splitting logs, the axe rising and falling with a relentless, punishing rhythm. "Papa remembers my mother," Abby stated, not as a question, but as a fact she had long understood. "He keeps her in a big wooden box. It has a lock." The simple, profound observation hung in the air between them. It was the first time the source of the home's deep sadness had been named aloud. Leanne looked from the child's innocent face to the man outside, a figure of self-imposed exile, and for the first time, she saw the true shape of his prison. And Jonah, though he was too far away to hear the words, felt the shift in the air, the sudden, unnerving feeling of being truly seen. The crucible came, as it often did on the prairie, on the wind. A dry lightning strike miles away was the spark, and a hot, relentless wind was the bellows. By evening, the western sky was no longer blue but a terrifying, bruised orange, and the smell of smoke was sharp in the air. A wildfire was moving across the plains, devouring everything in its path with an insatiable hunger. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Jonah's stoic reserve. This was a threat his silence and solitude could not fight. It was a tangible monster, and it was coming for them. The ranch, his life's work, the only home his daughter had ever known, was directly in its path. There was no time for deliberation, only for action. "The well," he yelled, his voice raw, and the command galvanized them. For the next several hours, they were no longer a broken man, a displaced woman, and a small child. They were a single unit, a desperate army of three against an apocalypse of fire. Jonah worked with the strength of a man possessed, digging a firebreak until his hands were raw and bleeding. Leanne, her small frame belying an incredible strength and resolve, hauled bucket after bucket of water from the well, soaking the ground around the house and barn. Even Abby did her part, stamping out small, rogue embers that leaped the line, her small face smudged with soot and streaked with tears of fear. The heat was a physical blow, the roar of the approaching flames a constant, deafening thunder, and the air grew thick with smoke that burned their lungs and stung their eyes. They moved in a haze of instinct and adrenaline, their individual pasts and private griefs burned away by the singular, urgent need to survive this night together. As the wall of fire crested the nearby ridge, a terrifying curtain of red and black, they were forced back to the house, the heat too intense to bear. They huddled in the small cabin, the air thick with the smell of smoke, the windows glowing with an infernal light. The world outside was an inferno. In this small, suffocating space, stripped bare by exhaustion and terror, the last of Jonah's walls crumbled. He sank onto a stool, his head in his hands, the image of the fire outside merging with the fire of a fever that had consumed his wife a decade ago. "She died in a room like this," he choked out, the words torn from a place deep inside him he kept locked away. "A fever after Abby was born. I sat here, just like this, listening to her breathe. And then, she stopped. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't stop it." His confession was a raw nerve exposed to the searing heat. Leanne, her own face pale in the flickering red glow, knelt and took the pail of water she had saved, dipping a rag into it and pressing it to Abby's frightened face. Her own past was a landscape of ash and loss. "They took my husband," she said, her voice a low, steady current in the roaring chaos. "Soldiers. My village was burned. I ran with my son, but the river was too cold. He was so small the stories of their separate destructions met in the heart of the firestorm. They were two people from opposite ends of the earth, their lives shaped by what had been taken from them. In the shared terror of the night, watching the world burn, they found a common ground forged in grief, a profound and unshakable recognition of the survivor in each other's eyes. The fire outside threatened to take everything, but inside the small cabin, it was forging something new and unbreakable. By some miracle of the wind's changing direction and their own desperate efforts, the main fire front passed them by, leaving a scarred, blackened landscape but sparing the house and barn. The dawn broke over a world of smoke and ash, a scene of grim desolation. But they had survived. The shared trial had irrevocably altered the space between them. The silence that returned was not one of distance, but of deep, mutual understanding. A few weeks later, their supplies ruined by smoke and water, they had no choice but to go to town. As their wagon rolled down the main street, the townsfolk stared at the strange trio, the grim rancher, the Chinese woman, and the small child, all of them bearing the soot-stained marks of their ordeal. In front of the saloon stood Nash, the ringleader of the men who had tormented Liane. Seeing her, his lip curled into a sneer. "Well, look what the fire spat out," he drawled, his voice carrying. "Decided to keep her, did you, Jonah? Find a new use for her?" The venom in his words was meant to humiliate, to remind Liane of her place. Jonah, who had never once in his life engaged in a public confrontation, brought the wagon to a halt. He didn't get down. He just sat there, his hands resting on his knees, and turned his head. He looked directly at Nash, and his voice, when it came, was quiet, but it had the cold, hard finality of a rock slide. "She is my wife," he said. The simple, shocking lie silenced the street. It was a shield, a claim, a fortress built of 4 words. Nash was left speechless. Jonah then clicked the reins and drove on to the general store, leaving the stunned town in his wake. Before they left, he did something even more unexpected. He walked to the counter and bought a simple, unadorned silver ring, a thin band of metal that cost him nearly all the money he had. He didn't say a word, just tucked it into his pocket, the weight of it both a burden and a promise. The journey back to the ranch was a long one, the silence in the wagon now filled with the echo of Jonah's public declaration. The silver ring remained in his pocket, a secret between him and the worn fabric. Liane sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the blackened prairie that was already showing the first, tentative signs of new life. What he had done in town was more than a defense, it was a reordering of their world. He had drawn a line in the dust, placing her firmly on his side of it, under his name and his protection. He had given her an honor she had been denied, a status that shielded her from the cruelty of others. But it was a lie, a noble one perhaps, but a lie nonetheless. That evening, after Abby was asleep, the unspoken tension was a living thing in the small cabin. Jonah finally moved. He didn't speak. He walked to the large wooden chest that had sat, locked and silent, at the foot of his bed for 10 years. The chest Abby had spoken of. He pulled a key from his pocket and turned the lock. The lid opened with a low groan. Inside, neatly folded, were his late wife's belongings, a faded calico dress, a book of poetry with a pressed flower between the pages, a pair of small, worn shoes. He did not offer them to Liane. He did not ask her to replace the woman who had worn them. He simply opened the box, sharing the contents of his guarded heart with her. It was an act of immense trust, an invitation into the most sacred and painful room of his memory. He was showing her the ghost he lived with, not to haunt her, but to introduce her. He let the moment settle, allowing the shared history to fill the room. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, simple silver ring. It looked almost luminous in the warm lamplight. He held it out on his calloused palm, the metal a stark contrast to his rough skin. It was not a grand gesture. His hand did not tremble. His gaze was steady and direct. He was a man who spoke in actions, and this was his vocabulary of love. "In town," he began, his voice low and even, "I spoke a lie to protect you." He paused, his eyes searching hers, making sure she understood. "I would like to make it the truth." It was the most vulnerable he had ever been, the most honest. He was not offering her a life of ease or riches. He was offering her the entirety of his broken, healing self. He was offering her a partnership forged in silence, tested by fire, and declared in the face of a hostile world. He was offering her a home, not just in his house, but in his life. Liane looked from the ring in his hand to the open chest, and then to his face. She saw it all there, the decade of grief, the fierce protection, the profound, quiet respect. She saw a man who had built a wall of silence around his heart, and then, for her, had found the courage to speak. Her answer was as quiet and certain as his question. She did not say yes. Instead, she reached out and gently took the ring from his palm, her fingers brushing against his. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace, she slid the simple silver band onto her own finger. It fit perfectly. The first snows of winter fell on a ranch that was no longer a place of exile. The silence inside the cabin was now a comfortable, warm blanket, not a cold, empty shroud. Laughter, a sound once so foreign it would have seemed like a trespass, was now a frequent guest, mostly from Abby, but sometimes a low, rumbling chuckle from Jonah or a soft, musical laugh from Leanne. They had made his lie the truth, a quiet ceremony with only the prairie and the sky as their witnesses. Jonah had not replaced the memory of his first wife, he had simply made room for a new life to grow alongside it. He learned that a heart was not a finite space, that love did not subtract, it added. He had opened the locked chest of his past, and in doing so, had opened the door to his future. He taught Leanne how to read the land, the language of the clouds, the signs of a coming storm. She, in turn, taught him the quiet poetry of her own culture, showing him how to find beauty in the smallest things, the intricate pattern of frost on a windowpane, the resilience of a single green shoot pushing through the ashes of the burned field. They were two solitary souls who had been scarred by the world, who had found each other in an act of transactional desperation. He had offered her a roof over her head, and she had rebuilt the home underneath it. He had covered her with a blanket to save her from shame, and she had wrapped his heart in a warmth that thawed a decade of winter. Standing on the porch, watching the snow fall, with his wife by his side and his daughter's bright laughter ringing from inside, Jonah finally understood. He hadn't just rescued her that day in the dusty alley. They had, in their own quiet, profound way, rescued each other. The seasons that followed were a testament to their earned peace. The blackened fields, nourished by the ash, returned in the spring with a carpet of vibrant green grass and wildflowers. The garden Leanne tended expanded, its bounty filling their cellar and their table. The house was no longer silent, it was filled with the quiet hum of a family, a tapestry woven from 3 different threads into a single, strong cloth. Jonah's face, once a mask of grim endurance, softened. The harsh lines around his eyes and mouth were still there, but now they were accompanied by a gentle crinkle when he smiled, which he did more and more often. Leanne, who had arrived as a ghost, a refugee from a cruel world, was now the heart of their home, her quiet strength the bedrock on which their lives were built. Abby blossomed in the warmth, her childish chatter a constant, joyful music. The world outside their fences, with its harsh judgments and cruelties, faded into the distance. They had built their own world on this small patch of land, a sanctuary of mutual respect and quiet devotion. The story of the rancher and the woman he rescued became a local legend, told in hushed and often inaccurate ways. But the truth was simpler and far more profound. It was not a story of a hero and a damsel. It was the story of 2 broken halves of a single soul, finding each other in the wilderness, and having the courage to piece themselves back together, creating a love that was not loud or dramatic, but as sturdy and enduring as the ancient prairie itself. They had learned that a home is not a place you find, but something you build, board by board, meal by meal, word by silent, understanding word.